There's a fundamental problem with the preparedness community, one that nobody wants to acknowledge. The harder you prepare, the more visible you become. The more resources you accumulate, the larger the target you paint on yourself. The stronger your defensive position, the more committed you are to a location that may become indefensible. This isn't a minor tactical oversight. It's a structural flaw, one that undermines the entire premise of what most people call preparation. Walk through any prepper forum, any survival expo, any homesteading community, and you'll see the same pattern repeating. People building bunkers, stockpiling years of food, installing solar arrays, fortifying properties, organizing mutual defense groups. They're doing everything the preparedness industry tells them to do. They're following the checklist. They're investing tens of thousands of dollars into what they believe is security. And they're creating the exact conditions that will get them killed. The prepper community has convinced itself that survival is a function of accumulation. More food, more ammunition, more fuel, more equipment. The assumption is simple. Whoever has the most resources when the music stops wins. But this logic only works if you exist in isolation. It only functions if nobody else becomes visible, and it always becomes visible. You've transformed from survivalist into resource depot. You've become infrastructure in someone else's survival plan. Consider what you're actually optimizing for when you prep in the conventional sense. You're optimizing for a scenario where social order collapses completely and instantly, where your neighbors simultaneously lose all awareness of your existence, and where your stockpile outlasts the duration of chaos before systems restore themselves. You're betting on a very specific type of disaster, short enough that your resources last, severe enough that institutions fail, but somehow selective enough that the hundreds of people within walking distance of your property either don't notice you or lack the organization to act on what they know. That scenario doesn't exist in history. It's not how collapse works. It's not how human behavior works. And it's certainly not how information works in communities where people have lived near each other for years. The problem isn't that preppers are preparing. The problem is that they're preparing in ways that announce their preparation. They're optimizing for material abundance in an environment that will punish material abundance. They're building fixed positions in a fluid threat landscape. They're making themselves targets while believing they're making themselves secure. This isn't theoretical. Every major collapse in modern history shows the same pattern. The prepared don't outlast the unprepared because of their stockpiles. The survivors are those who remain below the targeting threshold, who maintain mobility, who don't commit to defending a fixed position against people who have time, numbers, and nothing to lose. The survivors are the ones nobody thought had anything worth taking. If you're invested in the identity of being prepared, if you've spent years building your security infrastructure, if you've organized your life around the belief that your stockpile and your defensive position equal safety, then what I'm about to walk through will be uncomfortable. Because the evidence suggests that everything you've done to prepare has actually made you less likely to survive. Not because preparation itself is wrong, but because you've been preparing for the wrong variable entirely. You've been optimizing for strength. You should have been optimizing
has a specific vulnerability when it comes to uncertainty. We feel better when we can see, touch, and count the things we believe will protect us. A basement full of food feels like security. A wall of ammunition cans feels like power. Rows of water barrels, shelves of medical supplies, racks of tools. All of it creates a tangible sense of control in a world that feels increasingly uncontrollable. This emotional response is so powerful that it overrides rational analysis. It feels so much like preparation that we stop asking whether individual level. Just as airport screening makes passengers feel safer without necessarily making them safer, stockpiling makes preppers feel prepared without necessarily making them more
derived from accumulation is immediate and visceral. The strategic vulnerabilities created by that accumulation are abstract and delayed. Our brains aren't wired to weigh those two things equally. We take the emotional win now and discount the risk that might materialize later. There's a reason why this bias exists. For most of human history, having more resources did correlate with better survival outcomes. Food stores meant you could outlast a drought. Firewood meant you could survive winter. Weapons meant you could defend against predators. The environment was relatively static. Threats were relatively predictable, and accumulation was a legitimate survival strategy. But that environment no longer exists for most people. The threats have changed. The social density has changed. The information landscape has changed. And yet, the psychological reward system remains calibrated to an ancestral environment, one where more stuff genuinely meant more security. Watch what happens when someone starts prepping. The first purchases feel productive. Every case of canned goods, every first aid kit, every bag of rice generates a measurable dopamine response. Progress feels tangible. The anxiety that drove the initial decision to prepare begins to diminish, not because the actual threat has changed, but because the act of accumulation satisfies the brain's demand for control. The problem is that this emotional satisfaction creates a feedback loop, one that has nothing to do with strategic effectiveness. As the stockpile grows, the prepper begins to think in terms of their inventory rather than their situation. How many months of food do I have? How many rounds of ammunition? How much fuel? The metrics become the goal. The accumulation becomes the strategy. And the fundamental question, what specific scenario am I preparing for, and does this approach actually work in that scenario, gets buried under the psychological reward of adding to the pile. This is the same cognitive trap that destroyed civilizations. Ancient Egypt stored grain in massive quantities. They built infrastructure around accumulation. They created entire bureaucracies to manage their stockpiles. And when systemic collapse came, those grain stores became targets. They became points of conflict. They made Egypt attractive to invaders and created internal power struggles over who controlled the resources. The accumulation didn't save the civilization. It created the conditions for its fragmentation. The Soviet Union stockpiled strategic reserves on a scale that dwarfed anything individual preppers could imagine. Food, fuel, raw materials, manufactured goods, all cached in quantities meant to outlast any conceivable crisis. When the system collapsed, those stockpiles became assets in a new economy, controlled by whoever could seize them first. The preparation didn't preserve the state. It provided the material foundation for its dissolution into competing power centers. The pattern repeats because the cognitive bias repeats. Accumulation makes us feel like we've addressed the problem. It creates a sense of completion. I've done the work. I've made the investment. I'm prepared. That feeling of preparedness is so satisfying that it actively prevents us from asking harder questions. Questions like, who knows what I have? What happens if someone wants it? How long can I actually defend this? What's my plan if defense fails? Am I prepared for the right scenario, or just the scenario that's easiest to prepare for? Material abundance creates mental rigidity. Once you've invested heavily in a stockpile, your thinking becomes anchored to defending that stockpile. Your strategies revolve around the location where it's stored. Your planning assumes you'll have access to it. You've created a single point of failure and then optimized your entire approach around protecting that point. This is the opposite of adaptive thinking. It's commitment to a position before you know what the environment will demand. The truly dangerous aspect of this trap is that it's self-reinforcing. The more you invest in your stockpile, the more psychologically committed you become to believing it will work. The sunk cost fallacy merges with the emotional comfort of accumulation, and the result is a person who can't objectively evaluate whether their strategy makes sense. They've bought their own security theater. They've mistaken the feeling of preparation for actual preparation. And when the scenario finally arrives, they'll discover that what they've built isn't a survival infrastructure. It's a monument to a cognitive bias that every
that determines
failed
survival outcomes more than any other. Whether people know you have resources. Not how many resources you have, not how well you can defend them, whether anyone knows they exist. This single factor outweighs every other consideration in the preparedness calculus, and it's the one variable that conventional prepping actively destroys. Every action you take to prepare creates information. Bulk purchases at Costco, deliveries to your home, modifications to your property, conversations with neighbors, posts in online forums, purchase histories tracked by credit cards, shipping records, utility usage patterns. Each of these creates a data point. Individually, they might seem innocuous. Collectively, they form a profile. And that profile marks you as someone who has things worth taking when scarcity arrives. The preparedness community talks endlessly about operational security, but most of that discussion focuses on preventing strangers from discovering your preparations. Don't post photos of your stockpile online. Don't tell coworkers about your plans. Don't advertise your readiness to people you don't trust. This is elementary level thinking. The real problem isn't strangers, it's the people who already know you. Your neighbors who've watched you unload 50 cases of canned goods from your truck. The delivery drivers who brought pallets of freeze-dried food to your door. The contractor who installed your backup generator. The family member you confided in, who then told someone else. The cashier who sees you buying ammunition every month. The local government with records of your well permit, your solar installation, your property improvements. You cannot accumulate resources at scale without creating an information signature. It's structurally impossible. The modern economy is built on information flow. Every transaction generates records. Every delivery requires logistics. Every installation involves contractors. The very act of preparing announces to multiple parties that you believe resources will become scarce and that you've positioned yourself advantageously. You've self-identified as a resource concentration in a future scarcity environment. Now, consider what happens when that environment actually materializes. When supply chains fail, grocery stores empty, and uncertainty becomes acute, people don't suddenly forget what they know about you. They remember. The neighbor who seemed mildly interested in your gardening project now recalls that you were talking about food security 2 years ago. The relative who thought you were paranoid now realizes you might have been right, and they know exactly where to go. The people who delivered your supplies,
installed your infrastructure, processed your payments. They have records. They have addresses. And in a scarcity environment, information about resource locations becomes the most valuable commodity of all. This is the attention economy, applied to collapse scenarios. In normal times, attention is diffuse. People focus on their own concerns. Your preparations are just background noise. But the moment scarcity arrives, attention sharpens. People begin actively inventorying who has what. Conversations shift to resource mapping. Who was stockpiling? Who has a generator? Who has a well? Whose property would be worth targeting? The mental calculations that were idle speculation in good times become operational planning in bad ones. The prepper community has convinced itself that strength solves this problem. That if you're prepared enough, armed enough, fortified enough, you can simply defend what you have. This is survivability through strength. The belief that superior resources and defensive capability allow you to operate visibly without consequence. For the overwhelming majority of preppers, this is pure fantasy. Survivability through strength requires overwhelming force advantage. It requires constant security. It requires sufficient resources to outlast any siege. It requires attackers to remain uncoordinated and sporadic. And critically, it requires a time limit, after which normalcy returns. Remove any one of these conditions, and the entire model fails. You're defending a fixed position against people who have time, numbers, and nothing to lose. The mathematics don't favor you. They never have. Look at any historical collapse, and you'll see the same pattern. Resource concentrations become targets. Visible wealth becomes liability. Wealthy neighborhoods get raided first. Farms with obvious food stores get hit early. Compounds that advertised preparedness become focal points. Meanwhile, the people who survive aren't the strongest. They're the ones who were invisible. The ones who appeared to have nothing. The ones who blended into the chaos without presenting themselves as opportunities. This is survivability
no
through obscurity.
information signature. It means your resources are distributed, mobile, or hidden. It means your lifestyle, your conversations, your purchasing patterns, and your social presentation all signal normalcy, or even mild struggle. You're not the person people think of when they're looking for resources. You're not on anyone's mental
indistinguishable
map of target.
from normal life until it's deployed. Your neighbors think you're facing the same economic pressures they are. Your family thinks you're concerned, but not acting. Your digital footprint shows interest, not accumulation. Your infrastructure appears mundane or invisible altogether. When crisis comes, you have options. Others don't, but nobody knows that until you exercise them. This inverts the entire prepper identity. If your identity is built around being prepared, you've already compromised your position. If people know you as the person who's ready for collapse, you've painted a target. If your self-concept requires recognition for foresight and readiness, you're optimizing for ego validation, not survival. The most prepared person in any community is the one nobody suspects. The moment someone can confidently say, that person is prepared, that person has failed the only test that matters, the fatal flaw isn't insufficient resources, it isn't inadequate training, it isn't poor defensive planning. The fatal flaw is that people know you have something worth taking. And in a scarcity environment,
The
that
historical
knowledge
record is
alone
clear
is enough to kill.
once you know what to look for. Collapse scenarios don't kill people through the mechanisms most preppers plan for. Starvation is rarely the primary threat. Exposure is manageable for anyone with basic shelter. Disease spikes, but it's not the leading cause of mortality in the early phases. What actually kills people is other people. Specifically, organized or semi-organized groups engaging in resource extraction through violence. And the first targets are always the ones known to have resources. Sarajevo, during the siege, provides a useful dataset because the city contained a cross-section of preparation levels. You had people with substantial food stores, people with modest reserves, and people with nothing. The siege lasted nearly 4 years, long enough for clear survival patterns to emerge. What the data shows is counterintuitive. Having visible resources early in the siege correlated with higher mortality risk, not lower. Apartments known to contain food were targeted systematically. Families that had prepared became victims of home invasions, often by neighbors or people from the same building who knew exactly what was inside. The ones who survived longest weren't the ones who'd stockpiled the most. They were the ones who maintained an appearance of equal deprivation while quietly managing invisible resources. Interviews with survivors reveal a consistent pattern. People describe watching neighbors who'd been visibly better off in the early days disappear or get killed within months. Meanwhile, those who survived spoke of strategic poverty. They made sure their apartments looked ransacked. They appeared malnourished, even when they weren't. They hid any sign of having more than anyone else. One survivor described keeping a small, visible food supply that was obviously inadequate, while the real stockpile remained concealed behind a false wall. The decoy was stolen twice. The real cash lasted 3 years because nobody knew it existed. Argentina's economic collapse in 2001 to 2002 produced similar dynamics with better documentation. The middle class, which had prepared modestly through savings and tangible assets, became the primary target for crime. Home invasions focused on neighborhoods known to contain valuables. Rural properties with livestock or crops faced organized raids. Those who'd concentrated assets in visible ways, large homes, obvious security measures, known resource holdings, became systematic targets for increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. Meanwhile, those who survived with assets intact were the ones who maintained appearances of being equally affected by the crisis. They wore the same declining clothes. They complained about the same shortages. They blended into the general population, even though their actual position was substantially different. The Syrian civil war provides the most comprehensive recent dataset. Early in the conflict, families with visible food storage, fuel reserves, or financial resources became immediate targets for armed groups of every faction. It didn't matter whether you supported the government, the rebels, or tried to remain neutral. If word spread that your home contained resources, you became an extraction opportunity. Multiple survivor accounts describe the same pattern. Prepared families were identified through neighborhood intelligence networks, then systematically relieved of their stockpiles, often violently. The families that maintained access to resources throughout the conflict were those who distributed preparations invisibly, kept multiple small caches, and, most critically, maintained the appearance of having nothing. The Holodomor adds historical depth to the pattern. During the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, Soviet authorities specifically targeted households suspected of hiding grain. Brigades conducted searches based on information from neighbors, informants, and visible indicators of food security. Families that appeared too healthy, homes showing signs of recent consumption, any deviation from universal deprivation, were flagged as hoarders. That suspicion triggered confiscation, deportation, or execution.
The survivors were those who hid resources beyond the search capacity of the brigades and who maintained the physical appearance of starvation, even when they had access to food. Looking too healthy could get you killed. The pattern across all these scenarios is identical. Resource concentration plus visibility
The threat is criminal,
equals
military, governmental, or simply desperate neighbors. The mechanism is the same. Information about resource locations spreads through social networks. Groups with capacity for violence organize around that information, and extraction occurs because the holders are both known and stationary. The mortality data tells you what actually matters. In Sarajevo, people died from sniper fire while searching for water or from violence during resource raids. In Argentina, deaths from direct violence spiked, while deaths from deprivation remained relatively low. In Syria, the primary cause of civilian death in contested areas was targeted violence, not starvation or disease. In Ukraine, executions and deportations of suspected hoarders killed more people than the famine itself in many districts. This isn't about morality. It's not a judgment of perpetrators or victims. It's pattern recognition. When resources become scarce and institutions fail, humans organize violence around resource acquisition. They don't target random households. They target known concentrations. The prepared individual with a visible stockpile is not in a stronger position than the unprepared individual with nothing. They're in a weaker position because they're worth attacking. The prepper community studies disasters, but it draws the wrong conclusions. It sees people dying of deprivation and concludes that stockpiling prevents death. What it misses is that the people with stockpiles often died first, violently, at the hands of others who knew what they had. The survivors weren't the best prepared in material terms. They were the best camouflaged. They understood that in a scarcity environment, appearing to have resources is more dangerous than actually lacking them. And they structured
the
their
ways you've
preparation.
already announced yourself. Start with purchases. Every time you buy in bulk, you create a record.
The cashier at Costco who sees you checking out with 50 pounds of rice every month remembers you. They might not consciously think about it, but the pattern registers. The manager reviewing transaction data sees repeated purchases of long-term storage foods. Credit card companies categorize your spending. Stores track purchasing behavior. If you're buying large quantities of anything, food, water purification, medical supplies, ammunition, you exist somewhere in a database, marked as someone whose consumption patterns deviate from normal retail behavior. Shipping creates even clearer signatures. Delivery drivers know what gets delivered to your address. They see the boxes from Augustin Farms, Mountain House, Lucky Gunner. They feel the weight. They know what those companies sell. Every delivery is an intelligence data point, observed by someone who now associates your address with preparedness supplies. If you're using a PO box or an alternative delivery location to maintain privacy, that itself signals someone attempting to obscure their activities, which is often more interesting than the activities themselves. Property modifications announce preparation in ways most people don't recognize until it's pointed out. Installing a whole house generator? The electrician knows. The permit office has records. Your neighbors saw the equipment arrive and watched the installation. Solar panels, water storage tanks, reinforced doors, security systems. Each modification requires contractors, generates permits, and creates visible changes that your community observes. Even if you do the work yourself, the materials still have to be delivered. And bulk construction supplies trigger the same pattern recognition as bulk food purchases. Vehicle choices leak information. A truck with off-road modifications, heavy-duty suspension, extended fuel capacity, that signals preparation for scenarios where normal infrastructure fails. Emergency gear visible through the windows, communication antennas mounted on the frame, a vehicle configured for
might not articulate what they're seeing, but the pattern registers. This person is preparing for something. Conversation topics are perhaps the most obvious leak. If you talk about supply chain vulnerabilities, economic instability, social breakdown, or personal preparedness, you're identifying yourself. Even casual mentions. I've been stocking up on canned goods. We installed a backup power system. I'm learning food preservation. These statements spread through social networks. The person you told mentions it to someone else. That person mentions it to another. Within a few transmission cycles, your preparedness becomes neighborhood knowledge, even though you only confided in one trusted friend. Social media behavior creates permanent records. Even if you never post photos of your stockpile, your engagement reveals your interests. The groups you join, the posts you like, the comments you make. Algorithms categorize you. Advertisers target you. Your social network sees what you interact with. If you're active in prepper communities online, you've created a digital paper trail connecting your identity to preparedness, ideology, and behavior. Delete the posts. Leave the groups. It doesn't matter. The pattern has already been observed. Community reputation may be the most persistent leak of all. If you're known locally as the prepper, that label doesn't disappear. It becomes part of your social identity. People introduce you that way. This is John. He's really into survival stuff. From that moment forward, everything you do is filtered through that lens. Every purchase, every modification, every conversation. You've been categorized, and that category is exactly the one you cannot afford to carry when resources become scarce. Here's the deeper problem. Operational security measures themselves often function as signals if you suddenly become cagey about your activities, if you stop discussing certain topics, if you implement privacy behaviors that are unusual for your social context. People notice the change. The shift itself becomes information. When someone who used to be open becomes secretive, the natural inference is that they have something to hide. And in most contexts, that makes them more interesting, not less. Using coded language doesn't help. Referring to beans, bullets, and band-aids instead of food, ammunition, and medical supplies doesn't obscure anything from people familiar with preparedness culture. It simply marks you as part of that culture. The codes themselves are identifiers. The forensic reality is this. If you've been actively prepping for more than a few months, dozens of people know. If you've been prepping for years, hundreds have observed some aspect of it. The information exists in transaction records, in the memories of delivery drivers and contractors, in your social network's understanding of who you are, in the digital infrastructure that tracks all modern commerce. True invisibility isn't about being discreet with existing preparations. It's about structuring your entire approach so that no preparation is visible in the first place. And for most people reading this, that ship has already Community sailed. Loves the idea of the survival group. 10 families pooling resources, sharing skills, establishing a mutual defense network. It sounds like force multiplication. It feels like security through collective strength. The mathematics tell a different story. A group of 10 prepared families isn't 10 times safer than one prepared individual. It's exponentially more vulnerable. And that vulnerability scales with group size in ways most people never calculate. Start with information. Leakage. One person can, in theory, maintain operational security. They control their own behavior, their own communications, their own information footprint. Add a second person and you've doubled the points of failure. Add 10 families, assume 30 to 40 people, and you now have 30 to 40 independent actors, each with their own social networks, communication habits, and capacity to intentionally or accidentally leak information about the group's preparations. Every member is a potential breach point. Every conversation with anyone outside the group is a transmission opportunity. The information security of the group is only as strong as its weakest member's discipline, and in any group of meaningful size, someone will break protocol. This isn't speculation, it's network theory. Information containment fails predictably as network size increases. Each person in your group has friends, family, co-workers, but then acquaintances outside the group. Some will notice behavioral changes. Some will ask questions. Some will be told things they shouldn't know through trust, carelessness, or stress. One member mentions the group in confidence to a relative. That relative mentions it to someone else. 3 or 4 transmission cycles later, your survival group is common knowledge across a social radius far larger than you imagined. You've created a network where information wants to spread, and you're trying to contain it through individual discipline across dozens of people. The math doesn't work. Now consider resource concentration. 10 families preparing separately create 10 small, distributed caches. 10 families preparing together create one large concentration at a known location. From an external perspective, you've created a high-value target. Instead of needing to raid 10 separate properties, an attacker can hit one location and access everything. You've optimized for the attacker's convenience. You've reduced their search costs and maximized their return on investment. A prepared group isn't a harder target. It's a more valuable one, which attracts more sophisticated threats. The surface area of exposure scales faster than defensive capability. One household has one perimeter, one set of sight lines, one access point to control. A group of 10 families spread across properties has 10 perimeters. If they consolidate into a single compound, they now have a larger perimeter, more approach vectors, more infrastructure to secure, and more internal space to monitor. Meanwhile, defensive capability increases linearly at best. You get more people to stand watch, but complexity increases geometrically. More perimeter, more structures, more supplies, more failure points. Defense doesn't scale the way people assume it does. Geographic fixation becomes another liability. Groups preparing together inevitably established at a location, a rural property, a neighborhood, a cluster of farms. Whatever it is, you're now committed to defending that ground. You've chosen a fixed position before you know what threats will emerge, or whether that position is defensible against them. Individuals make this mistake too. Groups make it structurally unavoidable. You can't have a survival community without a location. And once that location exists, your entire strategy becomes anchored to terrain selected before the scenario materializes. Now consider internal defection risk. This is where the math becomes genuinely ugly. In a 2-person group, defection means betraying one close partner. The psychological barrier is high. In a 10-family group, defection might mean one family cutting a deal with an external threat to sell out the other 9. They're not betraying a best friend. They're betraying the group, which feels different psychologically, even though the outcome is the same. As group size increases, relationships become shallower. You might know everyone, but you're not equally bonded to all of them. Some are friends of friends. Some were included for skills, not trust. When stress rises and resources tighten, loyalty calculations change. Game theory makes this explicit. In small, tightly bonded groups, the cost of defection is high because you're destroying relationships with deep personal value. In larger groups, the expected value of loyalty declines as cohesion weakens. Meanwhile, the expected value of cutting a separate deal increases as individual survival stakes rise. Someone in the group will run this math, and they'll realize that their probability of survival might be higher outside the group than inside it. The strength in numbers assumption comes from a different security environment. In traditional warfare or tribal conflict, larger groups do have advantages. They can field more fighters, control territory, and project force. But those advantages only apply when groups are fighting other organized groups in open conflict. In a collapse scenario, the primary threat isn't armies. It's opportunistic predation and resource extraction. Fluid threats that observe quietly, gather intelligence over time, choose engagement windows, and disengage if costs rise. Against those threats, your size makes you visible, your locations makes you targetable, your resource concentration makes you worth the risk. Survivability correlates with obscurity and mobility. Groups sacrifice both. They believe they're trading those vulnerabilities for defensive strength. In reality, they're trading real security for the feeling of security. A compound with 10 families and a defense plan sounds more survivable than a lone individual. But the lone individual nobody knows about, whose resources aren't tracked, whose location isn't fixed, has architectural advantages the group can never replicate. The group has already committed to being found, being known, and standing still. Those commitments are fatal for the scenario's central fantasy of preparedness culture. A rural property, hardened structures, stockpiled resources, defensive perimeters, maybe a few like-minded neighbors within mutual support range. When collapse arrives, you retreat to this position, lock it down, and outlast the chaos until order restores itself. That strategy is optimized for a threat model that no longer exists. It's a Cold War solution applied to a problem that looks nothing like Cold War scenarios. And the mismatch will kill you. Static defense only works under specific conditions. You need a timeline. You need to know that if you can hold for X days or weeks, relief arrives or the threat dissipates. This is why castle sieges made sense in medieval warfare. Defenders were waiting for reinforcements, for the attacker's supplies to run out, or for weather to force withdrawal. There was a clock running. If you could outlast it, you won. Modern military doctrine uses static defense the same way. You hold ground because strategic calculus says the position has time-limited value to the enemy, or because you're fixing enemy forces in place while maneuver elements do the real work. Now ask the critical question. What's the timeline in a systemic collapse? When does order return? When do institutions restore themselves? If your answer is, I don't know, then static defense has no logical endpoint. You're committing to hold a fixed position, indefinitely, against an adversary, with unlimited time to observe you, probe your defenses, identify weaknesses, and organize an assault when conditions favor them. This isn't a siege where the attacker needs to take your position by a certain date. This is resource extraction. The attacker can spend weeks or months gathering intelligence, recruiting help, and waiting for you to make a mistake, or for your vigilance to degrade. The cost asymmetry makes static defense mathematically untenable. Maintaining security on a fixed position is expensive. You need 24-hour watchfulness. You need to secure every approach. You need to maintain defensive systems and perimeter integrity. You must prevent surprise, because in defensive operations, surprise means you've already lost. All of that requires constant energy, personnel, and resource expenditure. Meanwhile, the attacker spends almost nothing. They observe from outside your perimeter at near zero risk. They probe occasionally to test response times and identify patterns. They wait until someone gets sick, until fatigue sets in, until attention is diverted by another problem. Military history is littered with fortifications that failed not because they were poorly designed, but because defenders couldn't maintain operational tempo indefinitely. The Maginot Line was a technical marvel, irrelevant the moment Germany chose not to engage it directly. The Atlantic Wall couldn't be defended everywhere at once. Castles didn't fall because walls were weak. They fell because defense cost more than offense, and eventually the curve crossed. You don't even need to breach the walls. You just need to wait. Preppers make the same error. They ask whether their position can repel an attack. That's the wrong question. The correct question is whether you can maintain defense longer than attackers can maintain patience. For any individual or small group, the answer is no. You have to sleep. You have limited personnel. Attention degrades. Discipline weakens. Meanwhile, the people watching you can rotate observers, collect intelligence slowly, and wait for the precise moment your security slips. And the threat model has shifted in ways that make static defense even less viable. 20th century collapse scenarios assumed temporary disruption, followed by restoration. Nuclear war, invasion, natural disaster. You prepare for 3 to 6 months of chaos, then systems come back online. Modern collapse is structural. Supply chain fragmentation, institutional decay, economic breakdown without clear recovery mechanisms. There is no cavalry coming, no guaranteed restoration. You're not holding out for rescue. You're defending a fixed position in an environment that may remain hostile indefinitely. This turns the fortress into a commitment trap. You've invested resources into a location. You've anchored your strategy to that ground. Conditions shift, and the optimal move becomes relocation. But you can't execute it. Your resources aren't mobile. Your infrastructure can't move. Your psychological investment makes leaving feel like failure. So you stay. You defend. Even as the strategic calculus increasingly favors withdrawal, you've trapped yourself with your own preparation. Adaptive adversaries exploit static positions. They don't assault fortifications head-on if they don't have to. They isolate them. They wait them out. They create conditions that force the defender to emerge, cut water access, disrupt food sources, manufacture external crises that demand response. The defender has limited options. The attacker has infinite ones. They can change tactics, change timing, leave and return later, negotiate, threaten, deceive, or simply let time and environment do the work. The fortified homestead works in exactly one scenario: short-term breakdown, guaranteed restoration, and adversaries who lack time or organization. That scenario is the least likely version of collapse. Every other scenario, prolonged instability, organized predation, systemic breakdown without recovery, turns the fortress into a liability. You've built a target, marked its location, and committed yourself to defending it against threats you can't predict on a timeline you can't define. This isn't preparation. It's strategic suicide type of survivor that appears again and again across collapse scenarios. And they look nothing like the prepared individual with the fortified position. They are the people who had nothing, owned nothing, and were therefore free to move. Syrian refugees who survived the civil war, displaced families from the Balkans, economic migrants who navigated Argentina's collapse, street vendors who outlasted Venezuela's breakdown. They share the same characteristics: mobility, adaptability, low asset attachment, and environmental awareness. They survived not because they were prepared in conventional terms, but because they were never committed to defending anything. This inverts the entire logic of preparedness. The prepper with a year of food and a hardened property is anchoring themselves. They've converted resources into fixed forms: land, infrastructure, stockpiles that cannot move. When the environment shifts, They can't shift with it. They are committed to ground they chose before knowing whether it would be defensible. The person with nothing has pure optionality. They can move toward opportunity and away from threat. They can blend into refugee flows, labor migrations, informal economies. They can disappear when conditions deteriorate and re-emerge where conditions improve. They are not defending resources. They are exploiting information asymmetry, timing, and positioning. This is asset liquidity in chaos. In stable environments, illiquid assets are fine. Houses, land, stored goods, they retain value and provide security. In breakdown scenarios, illiquidity becomes a liability. Survival favors whatever can be converted into movement. The ability to abandon one position and establish another consistently outperforms material abundance. The merchant who can pack up and move has advantages the warehouse owner doesn't. The individual who can read social dynamics and shift affiliations has advantages the fortress defender doesn't. The refugee who understands checkpoint behavior has advantages the landowner who refuses to leave doesn't. History reinforces this pattern relentlessly. During the breakup of Yugoslavia, survival correlated less with preparation than with relocation timing. Families who read the shifting ethnic and political terrain early enough to leave survived. Families who stayed to defend homes and property often died doing so. Those who abandoned everything lost materially, but lived. And many rebuilt later because they preserved the only asset that matters in collapse: the ability to move. Sarajevo offers the same contrast. The people trapped in the siege were trapped because something tied them there: property, employment, identity, obligation. The people who left early often left with nothing. But they weren't in the siege at all. They looked unprepared compared to those who stockpiled and stayed. Yet they survived because movement, not storage, was the decisive variable. Nomadic populations demonstrate this at civilizational scale. Groups without permanent infrastructure, without fixed surplus, without territory, they must defend consistently outlast sedentary societies during environmental or political breakdown. Not because they are stronger or richer, but because they are never stuck in the wrong place. They don't defend land, they use it temporarily and move on. The Mongols didn't survive because they had fortresses. They survived because they had none. Modern collapses follow the same logic. Syrians who made it to Europe were not the ones who prepared and stayed. They liquidated whatever they could, paid for movement, and crossed multiple hostile environments until stability emerged. Venezuelans who escaped to Colombia, Peru, or Chile left with what they could carry. Meanwhile, many who stayed to defend assets became trapped in environments where those assets became both worthless, only makes sense if you believe order returns quickly. If disruption is temporary, defending a position until systems recover is rational. But if breakdown is prolonged, structural or geographically uneven, then bugging in means choosing to be a stationary target. Every day you stay committed to a fixed position is a day you're not repositioning ahead of threats. In fluid collapse environments, yesterday's safe zone becomes tomorrow's kill zone without warning. Mobility isn't just physical, it's cognitive. Mobile people think in options, routes, exits, and timing. They continuously evaluate whether staying improves survival odds. They don't suffer from sunk cost paralysis. When the calculation changes, they move. Anchored people think in hardening, fortification, and endurance. They defend investments even when defense no longer makes strategic sense. Their preparation locks them into decisions made under outdated assumptions. This produces a brutal outcome. The unprepared individual with no fixed assets may outlive the prepared individual defending a stockpile, not because they are smarter or tougher, but because they retain operational flexibility. A prepared individual has already sacrificed that flexibility by converting resources into immobility. In environments where adaptation speed determines survival, the person with nothing but mobility has architectural advantages. The implication is unforgiving. If your preparation requires defending a fixed position, you've already constrained your future options. If you cannot pack what you need and leave within an hour, you are not prepared. You are committed. And commitment to ground chosen before the threat environment reveals itself as one of the fastest ways to die when conditions shift. The fortress feels like security, but the ability to walk away from it is worth more than everything, and you don't realize it. Not by intelligence agencies, not by organized surveillance networks, by your neighbors, by the people who deliver your packages, by the checkout clerk at the grocery store, by the contractor who worked on your property, by your extended family. None of them are actively spying on you. They're simply existing in the same social space. And humans are pattern recognition machines. We notice things without trying to notice them. We remember things without trying to remember them. And all of that quiet noticing creates a distributed intelligence network that has already cataloged your resource position. This isn't paranoia. It's basic social psychology. People constantly observe their environment. They notice who's doing well and who's struggling. They track consumption patterns, lifestyle changes, purchases, and property modifications. Most of this happens below conscious awareness. Your neighbor isn't deliberately monitoring your deliveries, but they've seen the trucks. They've noticed the frequency, and some part of their brain has filed that information away. The cashier isn't cataloging your purchases, but they've built a mental profile. This is the person who buys bulk rice. This is the person who buys ammunition every month. This is the person always asking about storage supplies. In normal times, this ambient observation has no consequence. It's just social noise. But the information doesn't disappear. It's stored in memory, attached to your identity in dozens of small ways, across hundreds of mental maps. And the moment scarcity arrives, that latent information activates. People don't conduct reconnaissance after collapse begins. The reconnaissance happened months or years beforehand, without anyone realizing that's what it was. They already know who has resources, because they've been unconsciously tracking it the entire time. The psychology of desperation accelerates this instantly. When someone faces real scarcity, no food, no security, no prospects, their social calculus changes. Moral restraint erodes. Reputation stops mattering. Legal consequences lose relevance. Those systems only function when institutions exist and the future is predictable. Remove those conditions, and the calculation simplifies to one question. Who has what I need, and can I take it with acceptable risk? This isn't a character flaw. It's survival logic. Someone who hasn't eaten in 3 days isn't thinking about social harmony. They're thinking about calories, and when they start that calculation, they mentally inventory everyone they know. Who stocked up? Who has a generator? Who talked about long-term supplies? Who seemed too comfortable when everyone else was worried? Every data point they collected, casually, passively, unconsciously, becomes tactically relevant. Preppers consistently underestimate this dynamic. They believe that because they were discreet, because they didn't advertise, nobody knows. But discretion is not invisibility. The delivery driver who brought 3 months of freeze-dried food to your house knows. They may never think about it consciously, but if someone asks, "Do you know anyone who might have supplies?" your address comes up. Not because they were spying on you, because their job creates pattern awareness, and you are an outlier. The contractor who installed your backup power system remembers. You weren't like the others. You asked about off-grid capability. You invested more. You planned further ahead. That makes you memorable. And memorable means targetable. Your family knows too. The relative you mentioned it to, casually. The sibling who dismissed your concerns. The cousin who rolled their eyes when you talked about supply chains. They remember. And when their situation becomes desperate, they remember where to go. Here's the unsettling reality. Pre-event reconnaissance is automatic and ubiquitous. You don't need to be monitored by intelligence services. You're already documented through ordinary social observation. Every preparedness-related conversation, every purchase that deviated from normal behavior, every property modification that signaled future planning, it's been seen. No one was trying to observe you. They were just living near you. When breakdown arrives, that information becomes currency. People trade it. They consolidate it. They act on it. Questions that would never be asked in stable times. Do you know anyone who might have supplies? Become routine. And suddenly years of ambient observation snap into focus as actionable intelligence. The watchers weren't watching, but they saw everything anyway. And now, what they saw determines who gets targeted first. You can't undo this. The information is already distributed too widely. You can't make yourself invisible retroactively. What you can do is understand that visibility has consequences. And those consequences compound over time. Every additional day you remain visible is another day reconnaissance is quietly conducted against you by people who don't even realize they're doing it. The only people who avoid this dynamic are the ones who were never visible in the first place. And if you're reading this, thinking about your stockpile, your preparations, your defensive position, then understand this clearly. You were visible. The prepared group contains the seeds of its own destruction. And the mechanism is mathematical. It doesn't matter how carefully you've vetted your members, how strong your relationships are, or how aligned your values seem. When resources become scarce and survival stakes escalate, someone in your group will run a calculation. Am I better off staying loyal to this group? Or am I better off defecting? And under a predictable set of conditions, the answer will be defection. This isn't a moral judgment, it's game theory. And game theory doesn't care about your intentions, your trust, or your sense of loyalty. Start with the basic prisoner's dilemma. Two people cooperate for mutual benefit, but each has the option to defect and take a larger individual gain at the other's expense. If both cooperate, both benefit moderately. If both defect, both suffer moderately. But if one defects while the other cooperates, the defector wins big, and the cooperator loses big. The Nash equilibrium, the rational strategy when both players are rational, is to defect. Cooperation only persists when at least one of three conditions exists: enforcement, reputation cost, or repeated interaction, where today's betrayal destroys tomorrow's opportunity. In a collapse scenario, all three degrade. Institutional enforcement disappears. There is no legal system to punish betrayal. Reputation cost decline. Social standing matters less than food, and repeated interaction becomes uncertain. The future is too unstable for long-term relationships to outweigh immediate survival. You have now created the perfect conditions for defection to become rational. Now scale this to a group of 10 families. Each family is running its own survival calculation. As long as the group appears to be the best path to survival, loyalty holds. But the moment any family perceives that their probability of survival is higher outside the group than inside it, the calculation shifts. Here's the critical problems. Each family knows the others are running the same calculation. This creates defection cascade risk. Your incentive to defect first increases, because being the second defector is worse than being the first. The calculation itself is simple. You assess, what is my expected survival probability if I remain loyal versus if I betray the group. Loyalty means sharing resources, submitting to group decisions, and absorbing internal conflict. Defection might mean taking resources and leaving, or cutting a deal with an external threat, or simply abandoning the group to reduce your risk, improve your odds. Rational actors defect. Certain conditions accelerate this. Resource scarcity, which makes sharing painful. External threats, which make the group's position look untenable. Internal conflict, which raises the cost of cooperation. And most importantly, time. The longer collapse persists, the more the calculation shifts toward self-preservation. Early in a crisis, group identity is strong and defection feels unthinkable. 6 months in, with dwindling supplies and rising threats, defection looks rational. 12 months in, staying may be the irrational choice. History confirms this pattern. Prepared groups rarely fail because of external assault. They fail because of internal betrayal. During the Balkans conflicts, prepared communities collapsed when members sold information to militias or defected preemptively. During Argentina's economic collapse, mutual aid networks fractured as families recalculated their interests. Across prolonged breakdowns, the pattern is consistent. Groups hold together initially, then someone defects, and the group dissolves from within. The defection cascade is brutal. Once one family defects, everyone else's math changes. The group is weaker, resources are thinner, trust is damaged. Others begin thinking, if they left, maybe I should too, before someone else does. Groups don't fail gradually. They collapse suddenly once the cascade begins. And the first defector is rarely who you expect. It might be the most committed family, because they saw the deterioration early. It might be the strongest, because they can survive independently. It might be the weakest, because they have nothing to lose. There is no reliable profile. Trust degradation follows a predictable curve. Early on, optimism, cohesion, conflict avoidance. Under stress, disputes over resources, disagreements about strategy, personal tensions. Each conflict erodes trust slightly. Each decision creates winners and losers. Each external threat forces trade-offs between collective risk and individual safety. Every one of these shifts someone's calculation. You may believe your group is different. Stronger relationships, shared values, years of planning. None of that changes the mathematics. Strong relationships raise emotional cost, but survival probability overrides emotion. Shared values matter until scarcity makes values a luxury. Sunk cost feels powerful, but it doesn't alter forward-looking survival odds. Here is the mechanism you cannot escape. Someone in your group is already running this calculation. Even if collapse hasn't arrived, they're thinking about what defection would look like, what resources they could take, who they'd need to neutralize, what their exit route would be, not because they're disloyal, but because they're rational. And if they were rational enough to prepare, they are rational enough to defect when the math changes. The brutal reality is this: in any sufficiently stressed environment, defection becomes rational for at least one member. Once that happens, group stability collapses. And the larger the group, the higher the probability that someone reaches the defection threshold. You are not managing a cooperative survival unit. You are managing a temporary coalition of rational actors who will cooperate only as long as cooperation serves their individual interests. The moment it doesn't, someone betrays everyone else. And from a survival perspective, they are probably right to do so. If visibility is fatal, then survival requires you to control what others see, not through secrecy. Because secrecy creates suspicion and marks you as someone hiding something valuable. But through misdirection, You need to be visible in ways that remove you from target calculations. This means your preparation must exist behind a performance of normalcy, or, better yet, struggle. People do not target those who appear to have nothing. They target those who appear to have more than everyone else. Your operational strategy, therefore, is to ensure you are always perceived as having less. Normal life as operational cover means your visible existence matches, or falls slightly below, the baseline of your community. If your neighbors are complaining about grocery prices, you complain louder. If they are cutting back on expenses, you cut back visibly while maintaining invisible reserves. If they are worried about fuel costs, you drive less. You mention the financial pressure. You perform the same economic stress everyone else is experiencing. This is not lying about your situation. It is controlling the information environment. So observers naturally conclude you are in the same position they are. The psychology of assessment is simple. People use lifestyle signals to estimate resource levels. They observe what you drive, what you buy, how you maintain your property, what you talk about, and from that, they construct a mental model of your economic position. If that model says you are struggling like everyone else, you are not interesting. You are not a resource, concentration. You are just another person facing the same pressures. That makes you background noise in the resource calculation. Resources structuring must support this performance. Visible resources should match the community baseline. Your pantry, if observed, should look normal, not empty, but not abundant. A week or two of food at most. Your vehicle should be appropriate for someone with modest means, reliable enough to avoid attention for breaking down, but not new, not upgraded, not suggestive of excess capital. Property maintenance should be adequate, but not exceptional. Good enough that you do not stand out for neglect. Restrained enough that you do not stand out for prosperity. Your goal is invisible average. The actual resources you manage must exist in forms that cannot be casually observed. Think small, distributed caches, not one large stockpile. Resources stored without visible infrastructure. No external water tanks. No obvious solar installations. No modifications that signal preparation. If you need backup power, it is portable and stored out of sight. If you have food reserves, they are in containers that could be anything, stored in locations unlikely to be searched during casual intrusion. The structure assumes compromise is possible. Nothing critical is concentrated in a single, discoverable location. Behavioral camouflage extends to consumption patterns. You shop the way your neighbors shop. Regular trips, modest quantities, visible concern about prices. If you are building reserves, you do it slowly, across multiple stores, using cash when possible to avoid data trails. You mix preparedness purchases with normal purchases, so no single transaction signals stockpiling. You complain about the same things everyone else complains about. You express the same concerns. The performance is consistent across all visible channels. Social presentation matters as much as physical resources. You maintain relationships, but you do not position yourself as the person with answers or supplies. You are not the one people come to for help because you have never signaled that you can help. You commiserate. You express concern. You appear to be navigating the same constraints as everyone else. This is counterintuitive, especially for preppers whose identity is built around being the prepared one, the person who saw it coming, the one who will be fine when others are not. That identity is a target. You must abandon it completely in visible spaces. This misdirection is strategic, not moral. You are not manipulating people in a deceptive sense. You are managing signals exactly the way every organism manages what it presents to potential threats. A rabbit does not announce its location A prey animal does not advertise that it is well-fed and healthy. You are applying the same logic to human social dynamics. You ensure that the information available about you leads observers to conclude you are not worth targeting. This approach requires discipline because it cuts directly against human impulse. When you have prepared and others have not, there is a psychological reward in recognition. You want validation. You want people to know you were right. That desire for recognition is what gets people killed. Every time you signal preparedness, every time you hint that you are in a better position than others, you place yourself on a mental target list. Discipline means accepting that no one will ever know how prepared you truly are until it is too late for that information to be used against you. This performance is not temporary. It is not something you do for a few months until conditions stabilize. It is a permanent operational posture for as long as resource targeting remains a threat. You may maintain it for years. Over time, performance and reality merge. You drive an older vehicle not just for appearances, but because that is genuinely what you drive now. You shop modestly, not just to blend in, but because that is your real consumption pattern. The camouflage becomes lifestyle. The outcome is strategic invisibility. You are not hidden. You are in plain sight, known, visible, and unremarkable. What people see is someone who matches baseline, someone struggling like they are, someone who is not a resource, concentration, someone not worth the risk. You remove yourself from the threat calculation not by hiding, but by redefining what hiding means. You are not concealed. You are camouflaged. And in a resource-scarce environment, camouflage is worth more
survival
than any
infrastructure. But most people architect them wrong. They build tight bonds with specific individuals or groups, create mutual dependencies, and establish expectations of support that feel reassuring in stable times, but become liabilities in breakdown scenarios. The strategic approach is the opposite. You maintain broad, shallow networks where you are connected but not committed, helpful but not essential, and valuable without being resource dependent. This is strategic social ambiguity. People know you, they like you, but they do not have clear expectations about what you will do in a crisis, and, critically, they do not associate you with resource availability. Strong ties create obligation. If you are deeply connected to specific people, they expect you to help them when conditions deteriorate. Expectations turn into demands, and demands turn into threats when people become desperate. The neighbor you have helped repeatedly believes you owe them continued help. The family member who knows you are prepared expects you will share. The friend who has relied on your support assumes that support is permanent. Each strong tie becomes a claim on your resources. And in scarcity environments, those claims are enforced through social pressure or, eventually, violence. Weak ties, by contrast, provide optionality without obligation. You know many people across different social and geographic contexts. You have been helpful in small, bounded ways. You are remembered positively, but you have never created the expectation of sustained support. You are the person who helped someone move once, who offered advice occasionally, who was friendly without becoming essential to anyone's plans. This network structure gives you information flow, social capital, and potential assistance when you need it without binding you to specific people, promises, or locations. The ideal social position is useful but not essential. You possess skills or knowledge people value, so maintaining a relationship with you has benefits. But you are not the only one with those skills, and you have never positioned yourself as someone others depend on. Losing access to you would be inconvenient, not catastrophic. You create positive associations without creating dependency.
People remember you as helpful, not as a resource they are entitled to access. Geographic distribution matters as much as structure. If all your relationships exist in one location, you are tied to that location. If it becomes untenable, your entire social infrastructure collapses at once. Strategic network architecture means maintaining weak ties across multiple geographic areas, different cities, regions, and contexts. You have visited. You have helped. You have stayed in touch. If relocation becomes necessary, you are not arriving as a stranger with zero social capital. You are someone people already know, even if they do not know you well. Building this network requires deliberate restraint. You help people, but you do not become the person who always helps. You stay in contact, but you do not create expectations of constant availability. You share information, but you never position yourself as the expert everyone relies on. You remain present at a level that preserves positive association without creating dependency. This is harder than it sounds. Helping feels good. Being needed feels validating. Being seen as capable feeds ego. You must consciously throttle those impulses to maintain the correct social distance. The inverse is equally important. You do not create dependencies on others.
As someone who needs help, relies on specific individuals, or builds plans around mutual support agreements. Dependency flows both ways. If others believe you depend on them, they gain leverage. Leverage that can be used to extract concessions, impose demands, or enforce expectations you cannot afford to meet. Strategic independence means being friendly and connected, without relying on any single relationship for survival. Mutual defense pacts and survival groups are dependencies masquerading as security. They create formal or informal obligations that cannot be exited without social cost. Once you commit to defending someone else's property, or they commit to defending yours, you are locked into coordination that may not serve your interests when real threats emerge. The correct strategy is relationships that provide information and optionality, not defense obligations. You know people. You hear what is happening. You have places you could go. But no one expects you to show up armed to defend their position. Connected but not committed means you maintain enough ties for awareness and flexibility, without making promises that constrain your movement or compromise your security. You are part of networks, but not central to anyone's plans. You are an option people remember, not an asset they are counting on. This positioning maximizes flexibility. You can activate relationships when they serve your interests, without being bound by reciprocal expectations that no longer make sense. This approach is unsentimental by design. Relationships are not treated as emotional bonds nurtured for their own sake. They are infrastructure, providing information, optionality, and potential resources. You architect them deliberately. You maintain them at optimal distance, and you remain prepared to dissolve or abandon them if circumstances require it. The goal is not deep, meaningful attachment. The goal is a network structure that supports survival without creating vulnerability through obligation or dependency. The outcome is a social position where you are known, respected, and potentially helpful, but never seen as prepared, resource-rich, or obligated. You move through social environments without triggering resource calculations. You can relocate without losing all social capital. You can decline to help without violating established expectations. And when collapse arrives, no one comes to your door demanding support, because you never taught them to expect it. You are architecturally positioned to survive, without the hidden liabilities
preparation
that strong
isn't
social
about what you
ties
have.
create.
It's about how fast you can think and how accurately you can read changing environments. Material stockpiles are static. Cognitive frameworks are adaptive. In chaotic scenarios where conditions shift faster than plans can accommodate, the prepared mind outperforms the prepared bunker every time. This is preparation as cognitive flexibility, the ability to recognize regime changes in social systems, model potential scenarios in real time, reposition before threats materialize or opportunities close. Collapse literacy is the core skill. It means recognizing systemic transitions before most people notice them. Supply chain delays that others dismiss as temporary, you read as structural breakdown. Political rhetoric that others see as normal escalation, you interpret as pre-violence signaling. Economic indicators that mainstream analysis explains away, you recognize as regime change markers. You're not predicting the future. You're recognizing patterns that show the current stability is ending and something new is beginning. This requires calibrated pattern recognition. False positives waste resources and credibility. False negatives are fatal. Most disruptions are temporary. Some mark a permanent transition. Collapse literacy is the ability to tell the difference early enough to act, while others are still assuming
survival
normalcy.
critical when information flow is unreliable and conditions change rapidly. In stable environments, you can deliberate, gather data, consult experts. In breakdown scenarios, the information you need doesn't exist or can't be trusted. Expert consensus has fractured. Delaying decisions closes options. You need frameworks for directionally correct choices under uncertainty. Deciding faster than others even realize decisions are required. Scenario modeling is continuous, not episodic. You're not making one plan for one imagined future. You're maintaining multiple scenarios simultaneously, updating probabilities as new information arrives. Civil conflict, resource scarcity, or political instability. Each scenario is weighted dynamically. You're not predicting. You're maintaining awareness of what is unfolding as it unfolds. Decision trees map options before they're needed. If X happens, do Y. If Y leads to A, do B. If Y leads to C, do D. You pre-compute responses so that when events occur, you execute rather than deliberate. This isn't rigidity. It's prepared adaptability. You know the major branches Stress
and your
inoculation
criteria for selection.
matters. Most people freeze, panic, or react emotionally under acute stress. Cognitive preparation exposes you to controlled stress so that when chaos arrives, your thinking remains functional. Fear doesn't prevent you from processing information or executing decisions. You've trained those cognitive pathways. Option portfolios replace single strategies. You don't have one plan. You have multiple viable paths. Staying in your current location, relocating to location A, relocating to location B, becoming mobile without a fixed destination. Resources and capabilities are distributed to maintain optionality. You're never fully optimized for a single scenario, but you're adequately positioned for multiple outcomes. The real skill is judgment, knowing when to commit, when to wait, and which path to take in real time. Practice small decisions under uncertainty so that large decisions feel familiar and intuitive. Resource allocation discipline is essential. Overcommitting eliminates flexibility. Over-diversifying
Ensure
spreads
each
resources.
major option has enough resources to execute, while keeping uncommitted reserves to reinforce whichever option becomes most relevant. This is portfolio theory applied to survival, balancing diversification and concentration dynamically. The cognitive flexibility advantage compounds. Early in collapse, material stockpiles may look impressive. As events unfold and plans become obsolete, cognitive flexibility allows continuous adaptation. Static preparation becomes mismatched to reality. The person who can read the environment and reposition consistently outperforms the person defending a static plan, even if the plan was initially well-resourced. This inverts the standard prep model. Instead of, "What supplies do I need?" ask, "What decision-making capabilities do I need?" Instead of, "Where should I fortify?" ask, "How do I maintain multiple location options?" Instead of, "How much should I stockpile?" ask, "How do I build cognitive models that tell me when and where to move resources?" Focus shifts from accumulation to adaptation, from defense to positioning, from static plans to dynamic response. The outcome: preparation invisible to external observers, no stockpiles to target, no fixed positions to assault, only decision-making frameworks and environmental reading skills that allow you to stay ahead by continuously repositioning. You're not trying to outlast chaos. You're navigating through it, making better decisions faster than anyone else can make any. In environments where conditions change faster than plans can adapt, cognitive
scenario
edge
most
is the only
preppers optimize
preparation that
for is the
scales.
one least likely to occur: sudden, total collapse, followed by eventual restoration. The zombie apocalypse model: overnight societal failure, vanished institutions, immediate existential threats. In that fantasy scenario, a fortified position with stockpiled resources might work. There's no time for reconnaissance, no organized predation. Everyone starts from zero. Real collapse is gradual, and gradual collapse is far more dangerous because it gives time for observation, planning, and targeting. Economic decline doesn't happen in a day. It happens over years. Supply chains erode incrementally. Institutions degrade slowly. This slow-motion breakdown allows adversaries to accumulate information and organizational advantage, while preppers become increasingly visible. Consider the timeline. Year 1. Most people assume the decline is temporary. Preppers increase stockpiles, modify properties, organize with like-minded groups. Actions are observed, cataloged, and remembered. Social order mostly holds, so predation is low, but reconnaissance is already happening. Year 2. Conditions worsen. Preppers continue visible preparations. Observation and pattern recognition accumulate. Neighbors, peers, and emerging groups note who has what, who is organized, who can be exploited. Year 3. Institutional capacity degrades enough for predation to be viable. Organized groups have formed. Target lists exist. Preppers who've been visible for years are known quantities. Their resources estimated, routines mapped, defenses assessed. The zombie apocalypse model assumes everyone starts from zero simultaneously. No one has information advantage or organizational superiority. Gradual collapse creates the opposite. Information advantage compounds over time. Early, visible preppers may be the fastest to prepare, but their adversaries optimize for intelligence. They know exactly who has what before acting. Predation becomes strategic, not opportunistic. In sudden collapse, raiders hit random targets with low success. In slow collapse, groups identify high-value targets through extended observation, plan precise operations, and act when conditions favor them. The defenders' routines and vulnerabilities are mapped in advance. They aren't facing chaos. They're facing planned extraction operations against a studied target. Isolation compounds the danger. As conditions deteriorate, social networks fragment.
Preppers maintaining relative stability become outsiders, socially separated from struggling neighbors. This removes the protective effect of community integration. You're no longer one of them. You're a known resource, and outsiders calculate that you're a legitimate target. Timeline mismatch is fatal. Preppers typically stock for months or a few years, assuming chaos is temporary. Gradual collapse has no restoration timeline. Stockpiles deplete while breakdown continues. You become a former resource holder, known, exposed, and increasingly vulnerable. Institutional extraction escalates the risk. Governments in slow decline don't vanish, they become extractive. Visible preppers are easy to identify through permits, tax records, and purchasing history. You face organized requisition backed by residual authority. You're vulnerable to both private and institutional predation. Psychological dynamics worsen the problem. Early validation gives way to anxiety as timelines stretch. Resources dwindle, isolation grows, and cognitive commitment to defending a position makes abandoning it psychologically difficult. Preppers stay because leaving feels like failure, even when staying is strategically irrational. The asymmetry grows over time. Predatory groups learn, adapt, and coordinate. Their capabilities improve through observation and experience. Meanwhile, static defenders degrade as resources deplete and exhaustion sets in. The longer the deterioration, the more the balance favors the attacker. Traditional prepping works in exactly one scenario: sudden collapse with rapid restoration. Every other scenario, gradual multi-year decline being the most probable, inverts the assumptions. Visibility is fatal, static defense is untenable, and early preparation creates a roadmap for adversaries. The visible, fortified, resource-rich prepper becomes a known target, isolated in a system that rewards patience, intelligence, and strategic timing. Preparedness isn't about stockpiles or fortifications. It's about positioning, mobility, and invisibility. Holdouts in a slow collapse don't survive. They're eliminated when patient adversaries have
planning for
healed.
threats from desperate individuals or criminal groups. They build defenses against neighbors, raiders, or social breakdown. What they consistently ignore is the most documented and predictable threat of all: the government itself. States in crisis don't collapse cleanly. They extract resources as institutional capacity degrades. And the first targets are always the people who are visibly prepared. Because states in crisis know exactly where the resources are, and they retain enough residual authority to seize them. This is not speculation. Historical precedent is unambiguous. In 1933, the U.S. government confiscated private gold holdings through Executive Order 6102. Citizens were required to surrender gold coins, bullion, and certificates in exchange for paper currency at a fixed rate. The government knew who had gold because bank records existed, safe deposit registrations existed, and large purchases created paper trails. People who accumulated gold as a hedge against currency instability became targets for extraction the moment the state decided it needed those resources. Preparation created visibility. Visibility enabled targeting. And state authority made resistance futile for most holders. The Soviet Union's forced grain requisitions during collectivization followed the same logic. The state identified farmers with productive capacity, or stored grain, then extracted those resources systematically. The kulaks, relatively prosperous peasants who had prepared by accumulating land and resources, were targeted first. Their preparation made them visible. Their visibility made them targets. And state power
made seizure inevitable. The ones who survived were often those who had hidden capacity or appeared as poor as everyone else. Now, consider this. Modern surveillance infrastructure makes this process orders of magnitude more effective than anything in the past. Every significant purchase you make generates data. Building permits, utility modifications, credit card transactions, shipping records, online behavior. All of it forms a comprehensive preparedness profile. Governments don't need investigations to find prepared individuals. The data already exists in commercial systems and public databases that can be accessed or requisitioned when state interests require it. Property records alone reveal most of what a government needs to know. You installed a solar array? There's a permit. You drilled a well? There's a permit. You modified land for food production? There are assessments. You built structures? There are building records. Each one marks your property as having capabilities beyond baseline. In a resource crisis, those capabilities make you a priority target. Financial records complete the picture. Large purchases of food, equipment, or supplies leave categorized spending patterns. Banks hold that data. Governments can access it through legal mechanisms that become easier, not harder, during emergencies. If you've spent tens of thousands at preparedness suppliers, bulk food distributors, or equipment vendors, that pattern is documented,
Then there's the
searchable,
digital trail.
and traceable.
Online preparedness communities, orders placed through survival websites, preparedness videos watched, social media engagement. All of it produces a data signature. The same infrastructure that serves you preparedness-related advertisements can just as easily generate a list of individuals with high preparedness engagement when a government decides it needs resources. The targeting logic is brutally simple. States in crisis need resources. Searching randomly is inefficient. Identifying concentrated resource holder, medical equipment, or materials are required. Authorities will not search homes at random. They will use existing data to locate the people most likely to have stockpiles and extract those resources using whatever authority remains. And the authority already exists. Emergency powers, disaster declarations, defense production acts. Most preppers know these exist, but assume they won't be used against individuals or that they'll somehow remain unnoticed. History says otherwise. When states invoke emergency powers, prepared individuals are targeted first because they are the most efficient sources of supply. Timing makes this especially dangerous. State extraction happens before complete collapse, while institutions still have law enforcement, logistics, and enough legitimacy to act. You're targeted early, when rule of law still exists, when resistance can be labeled illegal hoarding, and when refusal becomes criminal interference with emergency operations. You're not resisting a failed state. You're being harvested by a failing state that still has teeth. This is where prepper threat models fail completely. A desperate neighbor is a manageable risk. A government agency arriving with legal authority, enforcement backup, and documentation proving you have needed resources, that is not something you defend against with firearms or fencing. Resistance makes you a criminal. Compliance makes you a donor without consent. The only strategy that works against institutional targeting is invisibility. If databases don't flag you, if permits don't mark you, if financial and digital trails don't identify you as resource-rich, you are not on the requisition list. States focus on obvious holders, documented, visible, permitted. Starting states having 10 quarters that revisionals promoted with another women's of construction, you are not on the requisition list.
The interesting reals profession is that secondly showed you and a comfortable living you. The invisibility plans, they call about those twirls, is the ald for pretishal terms. If they laughed you, are not doing them. The only president, they works from not important, with come to the front-limital teraments, they placed direcquisition. The medical front-limital teraments, they click the unblicknition, you will long to be invisibly. States focus on obvious holders. If dissipated not being invisible term, they move on obvious holders. If they look at, they didn't make invisible teraments was an obvious holders. The states focus on obvious holders, you are not on the requisition list, is that an obvious holder, and work this where you are not. States focus on obvious holders, when you work to the invisibility, you are not attentionally for this. You are not on the requisition list. They focus on the number of them, when they work to the unblicknition is visible. You don't say the state. The only strategy that was provide provisionally invisible with trails making on law invisible term. You are not on the requisition list. If they make them for, you are not doing them that it's visible, they do take everyone. This time, they only specific enshally when they make so far, then make the medical George's aimed ban proved. Investigated, this convoke to the invisibility's office when they starred is Englished to resist. Search, visible, permitted, traceable. The person who prepared quietly, distributed resources, avoided documentation, and appears baseline or struggling simply isn't worth the enforcement cost. The pattern never changes. States in crisis extract from prepared citizens before social breakdown, targets them. Your defenses against private threats are irrelevant if the government takes your resources first. And unlike private threats, state extraction comes with paperwork, legitimacy, and force. You prepared to survive collapse. The collapsing state sees your preparation as fuel for one more round of institutional survival. And they already know exactly where to look, because you documented it for them.
The diagnosis is clear. If you're prepared in ways that others can identify, you've optimized for the wrong variable. You've built material abundance at the cost of strategic position. You've created security theater that makes you feel prepared, while actually increasing your vulnerability. The fatal flaw isn't insufficient resources. It isn't inadequate training. It isn't poor defensive planning. The fatal flaw is this: people know. And in scarcity environments, being known as someone with resources is the primary determinant of whether you become a target. True preparation is indistinguishable from struggle until the moment it's deployed. Your neighbors see someone managing the same pressures they face. Your community sees someone complaining about the same costs, cutting back on the same expenses, worried about the same uncertainties. There is nothing in your visible existence that marks you as prepared. No stockpile to discover, no infrastructure to identify, no patterns that signal resource concentration. You've architected your approach around a single principle: visibility equals vulnerability. And you've structured everything to maintain invisibility. This requires abandoning the prepper identity entirely. If being prepared is part of how you see yourself, if it's something you need others to recognize, if it provides psychological validation that you were right to be concerned, then you've already failed. Every time you signal that identity, through conversation, through purchases, through property modifications, through online engagement, you're adding data points to the profile that marks you as a target. The person who survives isn't the person proud of being prepared. It's the person nobody suspects has prepared at all. Strategic invisibility requires 3 core capabilities. First, environmental reading. Recognize deterioration patterns before they become obvious. Notice supply chain stress when others see temporary delays. Detect institutional degradation when others see bureaucratic inefficiency. Interpret social tension when others see isolated incidents. Early recognition creates time advantage, allowing repositioning before threats materialize. Second, adaptive mobility. Never commit to defending fixed positions. Structure resources to be mobile, distributed, or abandonable. Maintain social ties that provide optionality without obligations. Manage psychological attachment to place so you can leave when staying becomes untenable. The fortress defender fights. The mobile adapter avoids the fight entirely. Thirds, threat threshold management. Remain uninteresting. Helpful but not essential. Connected but not committed. Capable but not obviously resource-rich. Visible consumption matches the community baseline. Property shows no signs of abundance. Behavior signals concern, not confidence. Mental models of you categorize you as same as us, not has more than us. None of this is comfortable. It means performing struggle even when you are not struggling. It means abandoning the validation that comes from being right. It means watching others make mistakes you've avoided silently, because speaking would reveal your position. The psychological cost of strategic invisibility is high. You never get credit for being right. You may even have to watch people you care about suffer, because helping them would compromise your invisibility. But the alternative is clear: becoming a target. Targets are eliminated through private predation, state extraction, or the mathematics of defending fixed positions in fluid threat environments. Preppers who build visible fortresses, stockpile openly, organize into known groups, or create infrastructure that announces preparation. They've optimized for a scenario that doesn't exist. They prepared for short-term chaos with guaranteed restoration. The actual scenario is indefinite deterioration. Prepared individuals become isolated holdouts, systematically eliminated by patient adversaries. The 99% failure rate isn't hyperbole. Historical collapse shows it repeatedly. The visibly prepared are targeted, extracted, or eliminated. The survivors are the ones who appeared to have nothing. The ones who blended into chaos. The ones who moved before threats arrived. The ones who read environments accurately enough to stay ahead of deterioration. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the best supplied. They were the most invisible. They were the most adaptive. Most people won't change their approach. The psychological investment in existing preparations is too high. The identity wrapped up in being prepared is too valuable. The feeling of security that stockpiles provide is too...
Becoming strategically invisible, prioritizing cognitive flexibility over material abundance, maintaining mobility over fixed defense, feels like starting over from zero. It means admitting years of preparation might have actively increased your vulnerability. Most people can't pay that cost. So they'll continue building fortresses. They'll continue stockpiling visibly. They'll continue organizing into groups that announce their preparation. They'll continue optimizing for material abundance while ignoring strategic position. And when breakdown arrives, they'll discover that everything they did to prepare actually made them less likely to survive. They'll be the early targets, the known resource concentrations, the fixed positions that are eliminated while the invisible adapters survive, because nobody ever saw them coming. The clarity is absolute. Survival in breakdown scenarios belongs to those who remain invisible until action is required. Those who maintain adaptive mobility over defensive commitment. those who read environments accurately enough to position ahead of threats rather than defend against them. If you're visible, you're vulnerable. If you're committed, you're trapped. If you're defending, you're losing. The 99% will fail. The 1% will survive. Because nobody knew they were there.